During the winter of 1879, when legal authorities finally exhumed the plots behind St. Stephen's Church in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, they uncovered a horror that would linger in the coal region for decades. Among the 157 coffins interred over a 12-year span, not a single one held human remains. Instead, each box contained meticulously organized stones, weighted to replicate the mass of the presumed dead, while ecclesiastical records indicated insurance disbursements exceeding $300,000, a staggering fortune for that century. What became of those 157 individuals who allegedly passed away quietly in their residences? The reality proved far more malevolent than anyone could have speculated, exposing a web of fraud that stretched from the holy pulpit to the most corrupt minds of Pennsylvania. Tonight, for the first time, we will disclose the full truth regarding Reverend Marcus Thompson and the conspiracy that converted a sanctuary of worship into a warehouse for human lives. Before we proceed with the account of Reverend Thompson and the enigmatic graves of St. Stephen's Church, I must ask you a question. This channel is not designed for a general audience, but only for those possessing the fortitude to confront the darkest chapters of American history. If you are prepared to explore narratives that others fear to discuss, stories that will compel you to reevaluate what truly occurred in the recesses of our past, then subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell. I'm also curious to know from which state you are viewing this account. Please leave a comment identifying your location. Now, let us investigate what truly transpired in those Pennsylvania coal fields more than 100 years ago. The truth regarding St. Stephen's Church begins in a location where hopelessness and faith intersected in a catastrophic manner. Millbrook, Pennsylvania, in 1867, was a settlement constructed on coal soot and shattered aspirations. Located in the Schuylkill County Valley, it was home to nearly 3,000 people, the majority of whom were Welsh and Irish immigrants seeking wealth in America's surging coal trade. The town's existence pulsed to the rhythm of the collieries, the dawn whistle summoning men to the subterranean dark, the evening bell signaling their return, and frequently, the tolling funeral bells marking another life lost to structural collapses, detonations, or the black lung disease that slowly suffocated miners. St. Stephen's Episcopal Church was situated on Elm Street. Its unassuming brick exterior and simple timber spire stood in sharp contrast to the grand Catholic cathedral across the village. The church catered to the Protestant population, mostly English and German families from earlier immigration waves. Unlike their Catholic peers, these Protestant miners often lacked the robust social safety nets that helped families endure loss. When the primary earners perished, Protestant widows frequently found themselves isolated, receiving minimal assistance from their neighbors or congregation. This social detachment would become the primary catalyst for the events that followed. Reverend Marcus Thompson reached Millbrook in the early months of 1867, a tall, white-haired man of 45 with icy blue eyes and a resonance that could either soothe the bereaved or ignite the faithful. He arrived with flawless credentials, having been ordained in Philadelphia and serving parishes in Harrisburg and Allentown, supported by letters of endorsement from prestigious Episcopal bishops. His spouse, Catherine, was a cultured woman who swiftly coordinated church gatherings and tended to the ill with visible Methodist fervor. Thompson's arrival was uncannily well-timed. The former rector, Reverend William Hayes, had passed away suddenly from a coronary, leaving the flock without a leader during one of the most hazardous periods in mining history. In Thompson's initial 6 months, he presided over 14 funerals, more than Hayes had conducted in his final 2 years combined. However, Thompson provided more than just holy comfort. He brought a groundbreaking concept to St. Stephen's, a church-administered life insurance initiative. "My dear brothers and sisters," Thompson proclaimed from his pulpit on a cool October morning in 1867, his tone vibrating with the weight of a holy mandate. "I have witnessed immense grief in our town, too many widows left with nothing, too many children left without fathers or any prospect for their futures. The Almighty commands us to organize for tomorrow, not just pray for it. The insurance scheme was straightforward and enticing. Parishioners could obtain life insurance policies through a firm Thompson had associated with, Keystone Mutual Assurance of Philadelphia. The costs were remarkably low, particularly given that other insurers considered coal mining an uninsurable risk. A laborer could insure his life for $500, roughly 2 years of income, for a mere 50 cents each month. Widows were promised immediate reimbursement upon the filing of a death certificate, with no intrusive questions or protracted inquiries. Within 6 months, more than 200 families had joined. What made Thompson's initiative especially appealing was his direct involvement with the mourning families. While traditional insurance companies demanded vast paperwork and often stalled payments for months, Thompson personally promised that families would receive their funds within days of a burial. He managed all the administrative tasks, communicated with the insurance firm, and would even provide advances from the church treasury to ensure no household suffered while awaiting their legitimate payout. Dr. Cornelius Whitman, who had recently opened a clinic in Millbrook, became a secondary pillar in this system. A graduate of Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia, Whitman was youthful, driven, and keen to establish himself. He collaborated closely with Thompson, frequently waiving his professional fees to inspect the dead and issue death certificates for the congregation. This Christian benevolence, as Thompson described it, was seen as another miracle the Reverend had brought to the valley. Samuel Crow, the village undertaker and caretaker of St. Stephen's Cemetery, finalized what appeared to be a perfectly synchronized support network for the mourning. Crow, a grave man of 50 with shock-white hair and hands permanently darkened by the fluids of his profession, had served Millbrook for 15 years. He provided flexible financing for burials, often allowing families to delay payment until their insurance checks arrived. His rates were reasonable, his demeanor professional, and his secrecy total. This triad of care, encompassing the spiritual, medical, and practical, transformed St. Stephen's Church into a symbol of security in a region where death was an everyday occurrence. Families felt a sense of safety, believing their loved ones would be treated with honor and that the survivors would be financially stable. The system seemed to be a blessing from above. And perhaps that was exactly how the deception was designed to function. The first indication that something was profoundly wrong occurred on a freezing February morning in 1868, though it would take over a decade for the gravity of the event to be understood. Thomas McKenna was walking to his shift at the Millbrook mine when he noticed a familiar figure walking along the railroad tracks heading out of town. The man was thin, wearing tattered work clothes, and moved with a distinct limp that McKenna recognized instantly. It was James Morrison, a fellow miner and a regular at St. Stephen. The terrifying reality was that McKenna had stood at Morrison's graveside just 3 weeks prior. McKenna shouted to him, but the figure continued on without looking back. By the time McKenna reached the tracks, the man was gone. Convinced that the morning mist and his own grief were playing tricks on him, McKenna stayed silent. He had been in the same shaft when Morrison was supposedly crushed by a support beam and felt a heavy guilt for not acting faster. Who would believe a man claiming to see a ghost walking the tracks? But McKenna was far from the only one. In the months that followed, ghost sightings became a whispered secret in the valley. Mary O'Sullivan claimed to see her late husband Patrick in a general store in Centralia. Agnes Fletcher was certain her son Benjamin had appeared at her window, looking gaunt but alive. Each witness eventually dismissed their own eyes as the product of trauma or exhaustion. Reverend Thompson even addressed these rumors from the pulpit, offering a compassionate but manipulative theological explanation. He claimed that the mind, in its desperation to cling to what is lost, creates what the heart desires. He called them visions of the soul struggling to accept God's will. The truth was far more systematic and infinitely more cruel. James Morrison hadn't died in a mine accident. On January 15th, he had gone to Dr. Whitman complaining of chest pains, the telltale signs of black lung disease. Whitman told the 34-year-old father of three that he had only months to live. When Morrison despaired over leaving his family destitute, Whitman locked his office door and presented a Christian solution. He proposed that Morrison be declared dead of acute heart failure. The family would receive the $500 insurance payout immediately, and Morrison would be, quietly, moved to work in the deep mines of western Pennsylvania. He could work until the end, knowing his family was safe. Morrison believed he was choosing a noble sacrifice. He had no idea he was choosing lifelong bondage. The Millbrook method was a perfectly oiled machine. Thompson provided the moral authority and handled the insurance paperwork with Keystone Mutual. Dr. Whitman provided the fraudulent medical certifications that bypassed any investigation. Samuel Crow filled coffins with stones to match the weight of the deceased and managed the convincing funerals. Labor contractors paid the trio a flat fee for every dead miner delivered as a forced laborer to remote, dangerous operations. Morrison hadn't been walking the tracks as a free man. He was being moved as human cargo, bound for the lethal anthracite mines near Centralia, where workers were consumed as fast as coal. These men became slaves in every sense, stripped of their names and their lives, while their families mourned over boxes of rocks. Thompson had successfully turned his congregation into a marketplace for souls, refining a template of predation that would grow unchecked for the next 12 years. He deliberately avoided the healthy or financially stable. Instead, his focus remained fixed on those already drowning in crisis. Men diagnosed with wasting diseases, families submerged in debt, or miners mangled by accidents who could no longer secure their wages. To these broken people, he presented what seemed like a holy rescue: instant financial security via insurance payouts, provided they were willing to make a temporary sacrifice. Dr. Whitman sharpened his ability to detect these vulnerable candidates. His medical clinic functioned as an intelligence hub. He knew exactly which families were facing medical bankruptcy and which laborers were in the early, suffocating stages of black lung. He instituted mandatory, preventative health screenings for every church member in the insurance pool. While marketed as Christian benevolence, it was actually a systematic screening for victims. Early detection is the shield of the family, Whitman would claim during church seminars, as he meticulously noted not just heart rates, but family debt loads and social ties. Men with large families but few local relatives were his primary targets, as they had the strongest motivation to disappear and the fewest people to ask questions when they did. Meanwhile, Samuel Crow transformed the art of the funeral into a masterpiece of deception. Utilizing his dual role as undertaker and cemetery sexton, he engineered coffins containing weighted arrangements of sawdust, rags, and stones to mimic a human body. To avoid scrutiny, the caskets were sealed almost instantly. Crow would solemnly inform grieving widows that the rapid deterioration caused by lung disease necessitated an immediate, closed casket service for the safety of the community. These funerals were designed to be emotionally draining. Thompson's sermons on redemption and divine providence were so intense that they left families too exhausted to feel anything but gratitude. From 1868 to 1870, 12 more men were processed through this machine. Each followed the rigid Millbrook method. A terminal diagnosis provided by Whitman. The sacrifice meeting, a private session with Reverend Thompson. The staged death, a falsified certificate in a box of stones. The payout, immediate financial relief for the family. The disappearance, transport to the illegal mining pits of western Pennsylvania. These men, Welsh, German, and Irish alike, believed they were martyrs for their children. They didn't realize they were being sold to quasi-legal mining operations that specialized in expendable labor. These pits operated in unstable deposits that legitimate companies deemed too hazardous to touch. The men worked 16-hour shifts in toxic tunnels, lived in squalid barracks, and died at astronomical rates. The psychological trap was the most sadistic element of all. Even if a man survived the brutal labor and managed to escape, he couldn't simply go home. To reappear would be to admit to insurance fraud, likely sending his wife to prison and stripping his children of the money they relied on. The victims were made complicit in their own disappearance. They were dead to the world, and the truth would only destroy the very families they had tried to save. By 1870, the conspiracy had generated over $6,500, a massive sum. Thompson was now the most beloved figure in Millbrook, his pews overflowing with people seeking his practical brand of security. Keystone Mutual was so impressed by the lack of disputed claims that they held up Millbrook as a model of efficiency. Yet, the system's success was its ultimate curse. Thompson had built an engine fueled by human misery that was now too profitable to remain small. What had started as a predatory arrangement with a few dying miners was about to evolve into something resembling wholesale slaughter. The central mystery that would perplex investigators for decades was not the criminality of Thompson and his partners. That would be proven beyond any doubt. The real question was whether they truly believed they were fulfilling a divine mission, or if they had simply realized that atrocity, when cloaked in clerical robes and presented with the language of mercy, could thrive in a community desperate for a miracle. The shift from opportunistic fraud to a factory of systematic misery began in the spring of 1871, sparked by an unannounced visitor. Colonel Harrison Blackwood arrived in Millbrook on a Thursday, stepping off the train in a tailored suit with leather satchels that signaled high-stakes industry. A Civil War veteran turned industrialist, Blackwood operated mining ventures in the most treacherous and secluded corners of Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia. What Blackwood brought to Thompson was a massive expansion of his market. During their clandestine meeting in the church office, Blackwood explained that he represented a consortium fascinated by Thompson's labor acquisition techniques. They required 500 healthy workers immediately and were willing to pay $75 per head, triple Thompson's previous rate. This single contract was worth $37,500, a fortune that dwarfed a lifetime of ministerial wages. However, the proposal demanded a shift in strategy. Blackwood didn't want the dying. He wanted robust men who could produce for years. He even suggested family packages, where entire households could be relocated under the guise of generous compensation for wives and children. Thompson saw the path instantly. They would recruit healthy laborers under false pretenses, promising high-paying jobs in distant territories while actually selling them into bondage. Families would collect insurance for accidental deaths that never happened, while the workers vanished into the industrial abyss. Dr. Whitman was initially paralyzed by the ethics of this expansion. Certifying the death of a terminal patient was one thing. Those men were already fatting and the insurance helped their families. But hunting the healthy crossed a moral threshold. What we've done served a purpose, Whitman argued in private. But this is something else entirely. Thompson's reply highlighted a complete psychological inversion. "Cornelius, you are being short-sighted," he said with the same pastoral authority he used to comfort the grieving. He argued that these men would be building the nation's future in new territories rather than rotting in depleted mines. He had become a master at reframing slavery as salvation and the total erasure of families as family protection. His rhetoric had evolved into a state of high-functioning delusion, or perhaps something much more calculated. Samuel Crowe, however, needed no persuasion. The undertaker had grown fond of the lucrative nature of the work. He even began suggesting ways to optimize the process and avoid detection. "We must vary the causes of death," Crowe advised. "Too many lung failures will look suspicious. I can stage mining disasters, house fires, or drownings. Each needs a different setup, but the end result is the same." The Hendersons, Robert, his wife Sarah, and their two teenage sons, were the first to be processed under this new system. Robert, a carpenter struggling to find work, was thrilled when Thompson offered him a high-paying job building mine infrastructure in Colorado, including an advance for relocation. It seemed like a literal answer to prayer. The plan was for Robert to go first and set up a home, while Sarah and the boys followed. Thompson even helped Robert take out a large insurance policy for the journey. In reality, Robert was declared dead in a mining mishap just 2 weeks after leaving. Sarah received a $1,000 payout and a letter describing a tragic tunnel collapse that had supposedly made his body unrecoverable. 3 months later, Thompson told the grieving Sarah that Robert had made pre-death arrangements for his family to join his associates in Colorado, where jobs awaited them. Trusting her minister implicitly, Sarah boarded a train with her sons. They weren't going to Colorado. They were transported to a fortified prison-style mining camp in West Virginia, where they were reunited with Robert in a life of forced labor. The Henderson tragedy became the blueprint for family processing. This method effectively eliminated any potential witnesses back home, while doubling the insurance profit and maximizing the labor yield for Blackwood's consortium. Between 1871 and 1875, Thompson processed 43 entire families through his machine, amassing over $85,000 in insurance payouts while supplying nearly 200 laborers to Blackwood's syndicate. However, this scaling introduced a dangerous variable. Unlike the original victims, men already marked for death by disease, family processing targeted healthy, socially integrated people who would actually be missed. Thompson required a flawless narrative to explain why entire households were vanishing into thin air. His solution was a masterstroke of psychological manipulation. He began fabricating stories of a grand religious revival in the Western Territories. He spoke of biblical colonies established on the frontier, where the faithful could build a new life away from the soot and sin of the mining towns. He warned that those called to these settlements must leave everything behind, severing all earthly ties to focus on their spiritual mission. "The Lord is beckoning his people to new pastures," Thompson would announce with theatrical gravity. Just as he summoned Abraham from Ur or the disciples from their nets, he calls some among us to sacrifice the comfort of the familiar to establish God's kingdom in the wilderness. This religious veneer was the perfect camouflage. When families like the Hendersons disappeared, neighbors simply assumed they had been called to the frontier. While unusual, it was plausible in an era defined by religious fervor and westward expansion. Thompson even manufactured proof, arranging for letters to be sent back to Millbrook from distant cities. These forged documents, written by his associates, described prosperous farms, thriving churches, and profound happiness, effectively killing any lingering curiosity in the community. By 1875, Thompson had created a criminal operation unique in American history, a factory of family erasure fueled by $150,000 in fraud and supported by a 3-state network of slave labor camps. Yet, the sheer volume of his success began to crack the foundation. Church superiors and insurance adjusters were finally noticing the statistical impossibility of St. Stephen's death rates. More dangerously, some of the initial victims had managed to survive the brutal conditions of the camps and were now plotting their escape, men who carried the intimate details of Thompson's betrayal. The unraveling began with the last person anyone expected, Rebecca Morrison. As the widow of Thompson's very first victim, James, she was seen as the shining example of the insurance program's success. She had used her payout to establish a thriving boarding house for travelers and supervisors. But Rebecca was observant. She read the metropolitan newspapers left behind by her guests. In October 1875, an article in a Philadelphia paper about a mine disaster near Centralia caught her eye. It listed 15 casualties, including a James Morrison, age 38, from the Schuylkill region. The age was slightly off. Her James would have been 41, but the name and location were too specific to ignore. How could another James Morrison from her same home valley have died in another mine accident 7 years after her husband's funeral? Rebecca began a quiet, obsessive search through out-of-town papers. Over several months, she found a pattern that froze her blood. The names were recurring: Thomas McKenna, supposedly dead of black lung in 1869, Patrick O'Sullivan, buried in 1870, Benjamin Fletcher, the 1871 heart attack victim. All were listed as active laborers killed in industrial accidents years after their elaborate Millbrook funerals. She realized with horror that either her community was haunted by a dozen identical name matches, or the men she had helped bury were still alive, or had been alive, long after their deaths. Her first impulse was to run to Reverend Thompson, but a flickering memory stopped her. The way he had always been too ready with a smooth explanation for ghost sightings. Using her boarding house as a command center, Rebecca launched her own investigation. She began writing to coroners, mine owners, and local papers in the regions where these accidents occurred. She posed as a grieving relative seeking closure, and the answers she received shattered her world. Official records from the Centralia Deep Coal Company showed that James Morrison had been on their payroll since March 1868, beginning his employment just 60 days after she had wept over his coffin in Millbrook. Employment documentation characterized him as a proficient laborer who had been integrated into a workforce sourced from eastern Pennsylvania. He had resided in company-provided lodging, accepted company currency, and was eventually interred in the corporate burial ground following his demise in a structural failure. This same sequence of events was mirrored for various other individuals. Men whose deaths had been observed and mourned in Millbrook were, in reality, active in isolated mining hubs for years after their alleged passing. They functioned under their authentic names, indicating they were not attempting to conceal their identities. They earned a living, lived in company quarters, and socialized with colleagues who recognized them as living men rather than apparitions. This evidence forced a horrifying deduction. Either the very concept of mortality had become unreliable, or the individuals supposedly resting in St. Stephen's Cemetery were never placed there. Rebecca reached a conclusion that would eventually lay bare the entire plot. On a frigid November night in 1875, she enlisted her brother-in-law, Daniel Walsh, along with two reliable neighbors to assist in exhuming a specific plot. They targeted James Morrison's grave, partially because Rebecca felt a personal entitlement to the truth regarding her husband, and partially because the site was tucked away in a newer, more secluded area of the graveyard. Working under the flicker of lanterns and taking turns with their spades, the four investigators expected to find either human remains or proof of grave tampering. Instead, they uncovered a casket packed with stones and sawdust, carefully weighted and shaped to mimic the physical presence of a person. The implications were shattering, yet they faced a new dilemma. While they possessed proof of a massive crime, they had acquired it through the illegal act of grave desecration, which could lead to their own imprisonment. Furthermore, they had no way of knowing the depth of the rot. If the Reverend was involved, who else was tainted? Dr. Whitman had verified the deaths, and Samuel Crowe had managed the burials. They wondered if the local police or insurance adjusters were also silent partners in the fraud. Rebecca decided to gather more documentation before going to the authorities. Over the following weeks, she and her team secretly opened 6 more plots, finding identical evidence in every one. Coffins weighted with stones to feel occupied, but devoid of any human body. Meanwhile, Thompson began to realize his operation was becoming precarious. Expanding into family trafficking had created logistical strain and widened the circle of people holding dangerous secrets. Some of the families moved through his system had relatives in other towns who were becoming vocal about the sudden lack of communication. Even more alarming were messages from Blackwood's syndicate regarding unrest in the labor camps. Some of the original victims had survived much longer than the conspirators anticipated and were organizing resistance. A few had even managed to escape, carrying with them direct knowledge of the false deaths and Thompson's deceptive recruitment. Thompson began orchestrating what he termed operational conclusion, the systematic destruction of evidence and the silencing of witnesses to allow him to relocate and start anew elsewhere. This plan included a strategy for dealing with any community members who might have stumbled upon his secrets. Rebecca Morrison was unaware that her clandestine digging had already drawn Thompson's attention, nor did she know her name had been added to a list of liabilities that needed to be permanently neutralized. The stage was set for a clash that would decide if the secrets of St. Stephen's would be revealed or buried alongside those who knew them. Rebecca held the proof to dismantle the scheme, but Thompson held the social power and the ruthless resources to eliminate a persistent widow. The conflict ignited on a somber December morning in 1875 when Rebecca made the catastrophic error of confiding in the wrong ally. She chose to go to Dr. Whitman first, assuming his medical oath and professional standing would make him an advocate for justice. She believed that if he had been tricked into signing the certificates, he would be eager to help. If he was guilty, she thought she could handle the confrontation. She was tragically mistaken on both counts. When she displayed her evidence, the photographs of the stone-filled coffins and the records of the deceased miners, Whitman's response was immediate and terrifying. He told her quietly that coming to him was a grave mistake. Within hours, Rebecca was confronted by the full force of the conspiracy. Thompson arrived at the doctor's office flanked by Samuel Crow and two unidentified, menacing men from outside the village. Thompson spoke with his usual pastoral weight, but the warmth was gone. He told her she had discovered something that endangered the entire community and claimed their work served a greater purpose of industrial progress and saving families from poverty. He framed his deception as a form of divine providence working through human hands, a justification that revealed his total descent into moral decay. But Rebecca was no longer the broken woman he had comforted years prior. She had transformed into a knowledgeable and resolute opponent. "You're not serving God," Rebecca countered. Her voice remained unshakable despite her underlying terror. She looked at him and said he was only serving his own interests, having converted their sanctuary into a slaughterhouse, their neighborhood into a predatory territory, and their shared faith into a commercial exchange for human lives. She insisted that James was truly gone now, as were all the others, having perished as captives in distant pits while believing their suffering served a righteous end. She labeled it mass murder hidden behind a clerical mask. This accusation struck with surgical precision, causing Thompson's elaborate theological excuses to collapse under the gravity of the simple truth. For a brief moment, the facade of pastoral warmth vanished, revealing a frigid and calculating persona. Thompson countered that what she termed murder had actually secured dozens of households and provided essential labor for growing industries, arguing that these men were already destined to die from black lung or industrial mishaps in their own depleted minds. He claimed they merely redirected those inevitable deaths toward a functional objective. Dr. Whitman then moved forward with his medical bag, patronizingly suggesting she was overwrought and that her findings could be explained logically. He tried to frame her actions as a criminal mental breakdown caused by the stress of grave digging, offering a sedative to help her rest, so they could handle the matter appropriately. However, Rebecca had foreseen this. Before entering the office, she had deposited comprehensive records with her brother-in-law, Daniel Walsh, instructing him to contact Philadelphia authorities if she vanished. She had also surreptitiously sent duplicates to the Philadelphia Inquirer and the state police. She warned Whitman that any attempt to sedate her would be viewed as assault before witnesses, and that if she were harmed, the evidence of their plot would reach state officials by the following morning. This revelation shifted the balance of power. Thompson and his partners had to choose between immediate violence, which would guarantee their exposure, and letting her walk away. Thompson attempted a final deception, inviting her to inspect their operations personally to see the truth of how the men lived, a clear setup for a fatal accident in a remote mine. Rebecca, recognizing the trap, agreed only on the condition that she be accompanied by state mining officials and journalists, with a predisclosed itinerary and guaranteed communication. These demands made his plan impossible to execute and showed he could no longer manipulate her. Samuel Crowe, speaking with the cold detachment of a man familiar with death, stated plainly that she knew too much and had prepared too well. Either she vanished that night or they would all be executed within a month. Thompson tried a final emotional blackmail, claiming that exposure would ruin the families who relied on the insurance money and leave hundreds of workers without protection. Rebecca was undeterred, retorting that he was merely listing the consequences of his own crimes and that the families were living on stolen funds while the workers were slaves who required liberation. This signaled the end of any talk and the start of what Thompson's journals called operational termination. Yet Rebecca had one more move he hadn't expected. As they stood in that office, two state investigators were already arriving in Millbrook by train, prompted by her earlier letters to the capital. The confrontation was shattered by the sound of approaching carriages and horses, signaling the start of the most massive criminal probe in Pennsylvania's history. The arrests of Thompson, Whitman, and Crowe on December 15, 1875, began an investigation that uncovered a massive trafficking network. Captain William Macready would later report that in his entire career, he had never seen such methodical cruelty, noting the conspiracy functioned with the terrifying efficiency of a major business. The conspiracy utilized the moral prestige of religious ministry to create a catastrophic environment of exploitation that impacted at least 157 documented victims. The subsequent inquiry brought to light details that horrified even the most seasoned law enforcement veterans. Thompson's private diaries, located in a concealed compartment within his church study, contained exhaustive records of every individual processed through his operation. Each notation listed the person's actual identity, their fabricated cause of death, the specific insurance payout collected, and their final location within Blackwood's network of forced labor sites. Even more unsettling were the theological defenses Thompson wrote for each crime in the same script used for his Sunday sermons. He had successfully convinced himself that he was performing a type of divine selection, identifying people whose deaths could serve a broader objective and orchestrating their removal. His writings revealed a man who had completely lost the ability to distinguish between a spiritual calling and a criminal enterprise. Dr. Whitman's medical files provided further evidence of the methodical targeting of these victims. His patient folders held meticulous assessments of medical status alongside family financial standings, social networks, and emotional weak points. Handwritten marginalia included insurance value projections and estimates of a patient's potential output as a captive laborer. Meanwhile, Samuel Crowe's workshop contained the most visceral proof. Investigators found step-by-step guides for constructing lifelike corpses, using stones, rags, and sawdust, as well as the tools required to seal caskets immediately following a wake. They also uncovered records of transactions with suppliers for specialized equipment needed to sustain the fake burial deception. The search for Blackwood's mining sites necessitated a massive coordinated effort across Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Ohio. Authorities discovered a web of illegal and quasi-legal operations where conditions mirrored antebellum slavery. Captives were packed into squalid barracks, given meager food, forced into 16-hour shifts, and paid nothing beyond basic survival needs. The most startling discovery was that many of Thompson's victims were still alive. Rescue missions at 14 separate sites liberated 87 survivors, though most were in such fragile physical and mental states that they needed months of clinical care before they were stable enough to testify. These accounts described a system of psychological warfare intended to crush any hope of escape. Laborers were told their families believed they were dead and had moved on. They were warned that returning home would trigger insurance fraud charges that would result in the imprisonment of their wives and children. They were kept in forced isolation from one another to prevent any organized resistance. James Morrison, Rebecca's husband and the very first victim, was among those found alive near Centralia. He had been held in bondage for 7 years and 11 months. His reunion with Rebecca became a landmark moment of the investigation, symbolizing the duality of the horror committed and the hope for eventual justice. The resulting legal battles were unprecedented. Thompson, Whitman, Crow, and 37 other accomplices faced charges ranging from kidnapping and insurance fraud to involuntary servitude and conspiracy to commit murder. The trials involved over 200 witnesses and thousands of documents. Thompson's defense argued he genuinely intended to help families in crisis and was unaware of the camp conditions, but this claim failed when prosecutors read his journals aloud. The most indicting entry, written after he visited a camp in 1874, stated that the Lord worked in mysterious ways by turning suffering into divine purpose, and that the men's temporary hardship served an eternal goal they simply had to accept on faith. Dr. Whitman's attempt to play the victim of Thompson's manipulation also failed when evidence proved he had personally visited the camps to recommend ways to increase worker productivity rather than improve their health. Samuel Crow provided no real defense, merely asserting that he was following directives and had assumed the legalities were managed by others. His decision to cooperate with the prosecution, which included providing a graphic and detailed explanation of how he manufactured counterfeit corpses and staged believable funerals, earned him a lighter sentence. However, it also resulted in some of the most unsettling testimony ever recorded in the courtroom. The legal proceedings concluded in October 1876 with convictions on nearly every count. Thompson was sentenced to life at Eastern State Penitentiary, where he passed away in 1891, persisting in his belief, as evidenced by his final correspondence, that he had simply performed the Creator's work through unconventional tactics. Whitman received a 25-year term, but served only 18 before succumbing to tuberculosis in 1894. Crow was given 15 years and, after his release in 1889, vanished entirely from the historical record. The ripples of the investigation extended far beyond these individual punishments. It triggered massive reforms in the insurance industry, such as the requirement for independent death verification and mandatory waiting periods for payouts. It also led to federal legislation aimed at curbing industrial forced labor and improving mine safety. For the town of Millbrook, the exposure of the plot left a trauma that spanned generations. Families realized their mourning had been commodified for profit, and parishioners discovered they had been spiritually led by a criminal syndicate. The psychological burden was heaviest for those who had unwittingly used insurance money for homes or education. Many felt a deep shame that plagued the community for decades. St. Stephen never recovered, with attendance plummeting before the building was eventually sold in 1879. The cemetery remained, but many families exhumed their loved ones to move them elsewhere, unable to tell if a grave held a relative or a box of rocks without an expensive investigation. Rebecca Morrison became a national icon, lauded by newspapers as the courageous widow who dismantled one of the era's most horrific conspiracies. She utilized her fame to lobby for insurance reform and victim support until her death in 1923. The empty caskets of St. Stephen became an enduring symbol of how malice can thrive when protected by religious prestige and blind trust. For years, the case was taught to law enforcement as a prime example of how predators exploit social institutions. Most disturbing was the realization that it could have been stopped sooner. Several people had reported seeing the dead in nearby towns, but their accounts were dismissed as grief-induced visions. The unquestioned authority of the clergy and medical professionals had created a shield for atrocity. The final statistics were staggering: 157 victims, $847,000 in fraud, worth over $20 million today, and a multi-state slave network. Thompson's final statement, delivered without a hint of remorse, claimed he had served a higher purpose by aiding industrial progress and saving families from poverty, arguing that his efficient methods surpassed traditional charity. This showed he had completely replaced moral reasoning with an ideological delusion that viewed slavery as a form of salvation. The legacy of the empty coffins remains a warning that the greatest evils often hide behind the greatest good, and that accountability must always accompany authority. Rebecca Morrison's bravery ensured that the truth was not buried alongside the evidence. What are your thoughts on this history? Do you believe modern communities are better shielded from such deception, or could similar shadows still hide behind charitable veneers? Share your views below. If you found this investigation powerful, please subscribe, hit the bell, and share this with others. Remember, the most vital stories are often those that were meant to remain hidden.